All right, come right back because I didn't want to make the videos too long. So thank you guys for you guys at home. I'm sorry, I try not to make them too long, so you're not too bored with it. All right. So now let's continue on with married couples. Tennis by the entirety. We're married couples. Now this that tennis by the entirety. When the wife dies, the husband owns the house, and when the husband dies, the wife owns some of the property because they own it in its entirety. There does not have to be a will. There doesn't have to be anything. The wife automatically owns. When my father passed away, my mother automatically owns the property because that is the law. All right. Now, this is one of the things that same sex marriage is arguing. Because if it's a law and they're married, when one dies, the other spouse, by law, gets the property without having to go through any kind of problems. If they are a couple that are friends, using finger quotes, that live together and one dies, the partner may not necessarily end up with the house. He may have to go out and qualify for it. He may have to go out and that's not really a fair statement because he may have to fight for it. Let's put it that way. Maybe one of the partners had kids from a previous marriage or whatever, and that kid wants to put allegations or make allegations to that house as being part of his inheritance. Okay. Worst case scenario, the partner may be subject to inheritance tax if the one that died left it in his will to his partner, where husbands and wives aren't. Okay. So this is one of the things about being married versus living together. The law of tenants by the entirety affects the living spouse completely different than it affects the living boyfriend because there are laws that protect spouses. Tenants by the entirety is one of them. Another one we're going to talk about is what they call the dower and the curtsy right. All right. The dowry, remember in the old days when the knights used to give away, or kings would give away dowries to get rid of their daughter, I mean, to marry their daughters off. It was called a dowry. Same thing. A man's interest in his wife's property and a wife's interest in the husband's property, dowry and curtsy right. So when my father died, tenants by the entirety gave mom the house. The dowry right or the curtsy right gave mom all of dad's tools because they were dad's and he passed away. Now mom has it. So that's the dowry and curtsy right. So property transfers under the dowry and curtsy. Now, we do have this thing called separate property. Does anybody know if Indiana is what they call a separate state or a community state? I always laugh. If you've been divorced, you know what state we are. All right. Indiana is what they call a separate property state. Just for your own knowledge, not that you really care. Alabama, Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, New Mexico, Nevada, Texas, Washington, and Wisconsin. 3, 6, 8, 10. 10 of the states we know of are what they call community property states. Now, here we go. Like I said, if you've been married before, you know this answer. Separate property says whatever I owned and I brought to the marriage is mine after the marriage. Okay? That's separate. Now, while you're married, all states use community property. So if my wife and I go out right now and we buy a couch, my wife and I both own the couch. If we were to get divorced, one of us is going to have to compensate the other for that half of the couch. However, the car that I drive is a Lexus. It was my car before Kelly and I got married. If we get divorced today, I would take the car with me, and she has no interest in that, no legal interest or monetary interest because it was my car prior to us getting married. Okay. Same thing with real estate. If one person owns it, but the other person then comes in and buys it or comes in and gets married, may not own the house. I owned a house free and clear, got married to my second wife, and you guys don't want to get me started on this, all of this crap. Got married. When we got divorced, I booted her, um, and she didn't get any value of the house because it was my house prior to that. All right. So separate property states say this: anything you bring to the marriage is yours after the marriage, or anything that you received as an inheritance while you're married, or anything you bought for money that was inherited while you're married. Okay. When we got divorced, my wife attorney said the bedroom set comes out of the communal property because it was willed to Kimberly from her grandmother as part of her grandmother's will. So even though that Kim and I were married when her grandmother died and we quote unquote got the property while we were married, because it came through as a will to her when we got divorced, the attorney reached in and said, okay, this comes out of the property because that does not get split. That's how you keep things like heirlooms. This is what allows us to keep heirlooms. You know, it's not that now she owes me for a part of that bedroom set. No, that was her bedroom set. All right. Consequently, or conversely, or similarly, depending on what word you want to choose, the silver, believe it or not, was mine. My uncle gave me the silver place setting for 12. All the silver knives and all that was mine when Kim and I met. When we got divorced, came out. Then they took all the other stuff, split it down the middle, and gave me all the bills and gave her all the assets. That's how divorces work in Indiana. Unfortunately, Zeke's shaking his head. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, you've been there. You know why divorces cost so much, Zeke? Because they're worth it? No, I'm sorry. I take that back. That's not nice. I commend anybody who was married 17. I was married 17 years first time. I commend people that can manage to make it work. That's great. I've been married now almost 3 years the second time. So life's great. All right. So separate property. What's mine when I brought to it's mine when I leave. Anything I earn from a inheritance or anything I buy from money in inheritance. Now, one of the other things they talk about here is personal injury awards. Injury awards are also partially separate property because when you're issued award money, you're issued money for pain and suffering, and you're issued money for lost wages. All right, lost wages is community property because my wife participates in the money I make and the food and the rent and all that. Unfortunately, in an injury, the pain and suffering, she does not participate in the pain I'm feeling. So that's all separate property, okay? So if someone's awarded an injury lawsuit, the pain and suffering portion would be considered separate property, while the loss of wages would be considered marital asset, okay? Now, contrast that with community property. Community property means the second one person says I do, then half of that property belongs to the other person. You guys, anybody here old enough to remember the Eddie Murphy thing? Remember when she was like, half, I get half, Eddie? That's right. California is a community property state. What's the word? People then use a lot of what? What's the word I'm looking for? Bob? Nope. No. Mary? Prenuptials. That's right. Indiana doesn't need a lot of prenuptials or because it's my property anyway. California, I own a house free and clear. I marry, my wife divorces me the next day. She gets half that house because they're community property. The second you say I do, you're done for. All right? So each person automatically then owns and they split it back up. That is community property. And like I said, there's only 10 states that are community property. The one that always gets me is Wisconsin, Idaho. You would think that right in the middle of the country, the Bible Belt kind of feel, they would not be, and I don't know if that's truly right, that community property is a liberal aspect or not. I don't know. Maybe it's more conservative to protect people. It just seems weird to me that Idaho and Wisconsin, and I guess, well, Alabama and Louisiana are. So who knows? So that's what community is. Once the property person says I do, they get half. Now I want to go back to that separate property thing because I get questions on this a lot, and I'm not sure. Was that the question you had, Cindy? Go ahead, give me your question. I bet. No, wait, don't give me the question. Let me answer it. Okay. In separate property, when I bring something to the marriage and I said it's mine after the marriage, don't excuse or forget growth. Growth is community property, right? That's what I thought. See, that's what I was going to. This is one of. There's two common questions, and you were going to ask one of them. One common question is, well, I married my husband. He had a 401k. Now we're getting divorced 40 years later. Is the 401k his? Well, when you married him, his 401k might have been worth $100 because he just started. 30 years later, it's now worth 100,000. Okay, that initial $100 might be his, but the growth of that is probably going to be community property. All right. And same thing with the other thing with the business. That's another common one. When someone says, well, he had that business when I met him. Yes, but it was one lawnmower when you guys were 16. He now owns three buildings and 20 mowers and 8 people work for him. So all of that growth might be subject to community property. Just because he owned the business and I own the business now, what's the size of business? What's the size of the 401k? Another thing I had one the other day where a guy said, well, that's not right because I own my house and then when I got divorced, I had to give my wife some of it. I asked him one question: did you refinance? And he said, yes. I said, okay, what's a refinance, Jose? No, Thomas? Right. Refinance is a legal purchase with it's a legal sale with a repurchase. And if you're repurchasing it while you're married, that's community property. So you see what you're doing? You're actually taking separate property because you owned it singly, got married, then you refinanced while you were married, which is a sale with a repurchase. You now bought it married. So your wife now gets half of it. So that's something you shouldn't want to do. All right. So single property and community property. Any questions on that one? All righty then.